Okay, I think we'll begin. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this event entitled Socialist Solutions to Climate Chaos, Build Back Better. This is part of Arise, an online festival of Labour-led ideas, and supported by a range of groups and publications, including Labour Assembly Against Austerity. I'm Liz Smith. I'm a Labour foot soldier for over 50 years, a member of the Momentum NCG, and a volunteer with Arise. At the moment, we are going through a major crisis, and we need to put forward ways to transform our world and create a world that puts people, planet, and health first. Part of this must be the fight for climate justice as part of a programme for socialist change. Part of this must also be progressive international cooperation. And we're delighted tonight to welcome Natalie Urban, who's a Brazilian journalist. Welcome, Natalie. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that we offer solidarity to you and the people of Brazil at this difficult time in your history. Arise is a celebration of our values, the values of internationalism, peace, solidarity, and unity. And we're very pleased to have this discussion as part of that. Due to an amazing level of interest, as well as the Zoom webinar, we are also streaming live from the YouTube Arise page and across a number of Facebook pages. As the event goes on, please post your questions in the comments below stream and in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll put them to our panel. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers. We have Angus Sutto, who's Labour for a Green New Deal. We have Mika Minio-Paluello, Labour Energy Forum. We have Faiza Shaheen, Director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, or CLASS. We have Mick Burke, Socialist Economic Bulletin. And we have Natalie Urban, a Brazilian journalist. A wonderful, wonderful lineup. So I'm going to go over to Angus first. Are you ready, Angus?
I'm Liz, thank you.
Okay, Angus, we'll let you start. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liz, and thank you to Arise for inviting me tonight. My name is Angus. I'm from Labour for a Green New Deal. For those of you who don't know, we are a volunteer campaign of Labour Party members fighting for climate justice and a Green New Deal, founded last year in 2019 and known best for our conference brochure at the Labour Party conference last year. Amidst coronavirus, it's can be easy to forget the climate crisis is still raging, and we've all seen images from Siberia recently. And it's important in that context and in the context of the inequalities that coronavirus has shown up to remember that the climate crisis is fundamentally a capitalist crisis. That's why we started the campaign to bring environmental and class politics together in a way that they all too rarely have been. And so there are often a panoply of stats that are used to justify it. And one can talk, for example, about fuel companies and how just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all emissions across the world. One can talk about their airline executives pumping up demand, aviation set to be the highest source of emissions in the UK by 2050. You need to talk equally about the inequality of consumption. The recent paper showed that to be stronger and more important than ever. Basically, that the rich are most responsible for climate change, that the corporate executives are the ones driving us over the climate cliff, and not us as individuals told. The climate crisis, as I'm sure other speakers can explain better than myself, is rooted in extractivism, colonialism, and the history of capitalism. An environmental movement in the UK has not always recognised this, that climate and environment are a class issue. And that's what we want to bring together and show the impacts of climate change in the UK are felt equally through the lens of inequality as they are across the world as of the global south suffering first and hardest. Take the example of fuel poverty. Living in fuel poverty in the UK in ill-insulated homes, while the government today announces subsidies for the rich to insulate their homes, the poor are still left with very little. Or take the environmental and racism and air pollution, in which working class communities, often working class communities of colour, suffer worse from air pollution in the UK. And there's often been a gap between the environmental movements, as I've mentioned. It often goes through the lens of jobs, of work in fossil fuel and aviation industries, in which the environmental movement shouts no jobs on a dead planet, and against which the trade unions and others talk about the importance of jobs. And often that stemmed, like I say, from an environmental movement which can't bring those two things together, and that's what we've sought to redress with the campaign. Really powerfully and really strongly in 2019, first through the Green New Deal, and the motion passed at Labour Party conference, passed overwhelmingly by trade unions and Labour Party members. Our motion was the most submitted by Labour CLPs across the country. Then brought together in the party's Green Industrial Revolution in the 2019 manifesto. This promised 1 million green jobs across renewable energy, insulation, agroecology, and so much more. But it equally also promised a big polluter tax, recognising that it is fossil capital, which is most responsible for the climate crisis, and making the oil and gas companies pay for a just transition for their workers. It also, brought together a really powerful public ownership agenda, promising public ownership of rail, energy, and water, allowing us to decarbonise at the rapid pace that is required. And of course, our campaign has been fighting for a 2030 target rather than a net zero 2050 target, as we believe the UK owes through its climate and its historic contributions to the climate crisis. But also, through a program of home insulation, for example, to insulate all 27 million homes in the country, cutting emissions, near eradicating fuel poverty, and reducing bills at the same time. Now, those measures in the party's manifesto, contrary to what some on the right wing might tell you, were in fact incredibly popular, and poll after poll shows widespread support for public ownership, for green jobs, including in the Red Wall, and for rapid decarbonisation, far in excess of what the Conservatives are offering. And of course, there's a vibrant and strong climate movement in the streets that's forcing that pressure along, from youth strikes through to Extinction Rebellion. But then, of course, we didn't win, but that should not mean that we fall back away from our agenda. It's both urgent to tackle the climate crisis, but also more popular than ever, and can be, as indeed the Labour Together report suggested, a real coming together point around socialist ideas. It's important in this context that we fight for a socialist Green New Deal. There is no way to decarbonise rapidly that doesn't involve expanding public ownership across the economy, as Andreas Malm have demonstrated. There's no way to reduce aviation emissions while relying on aviation executives. There's no way to have a just transition for those workers without having public ownership of those sectors. There's no way to decarbonise our energy grid without privatising it. And it's this agenda that we must fight for very strongly now. It's more also important than ever amidst the coronavirus crisis and the inequalities that it's shown up. The public health case for a Green New Deal is as stronger than ever when we think, for example, about the effects of asthma on people's coronavirus, and the power of the state home insulation program, which I think Mika will address, to deal with that. There's an economic case, and we've seen Labour really fail to put that forward, at least from the very top of Labour leadership in recent weeks for green stimulus, with at least 1 million green jobs. Think tanks like IPP are suggesting even more would be possible, and we need a really interventionist government to achieve that, to put people back to work, but also to transform our economy. And there's a social justice case for it as well, as tens of thousands of aviation workers lose their jobs, as fossil fuel workers in the North Sea lose their jobs. We need real government intervention and support for retraining and for training and jobs for the unemployed. We also need to end the parity that this crisis has shown, the way to do that, universal basic services. For example, the case of broadband has been demonstrated by this as a universal right. It was widely planned by the Labour right after the election. But in fact, when we think about working from home and access to education, for example, the case for universal broadband has really been shown and demonstrated in the light by this crisis. So we have the ideas. The ideas are there really strongly. That case for public ownership and that's Green New Deal is widely popular across the party. It polls very popular as well. But we still see, nevertheless, under the new leadership, a desire to row back from some of those commitments, particularly around public ownership, as well as a reluctance to advocate the social justice measures, for example, Labour rowing from a wealth tax in recent days. So that's what our task ahead as both a campaign and as a movement are. We have groups operating all across the country to prevent that retreat on policy and to fight back against the desire to water it down and to utilise the power of the Labour membership and the trade union movement. But we also need to bring the Green Deal much more tangibly to people. So far, at least amongst the Labour movement, it's too often been an insular idea for think tanks, Labour members and party conferences. One of the demonstrations of the 2019 election was, to a certain extent, our disconnection from a lot of our base. And so that's what Labour for Green New Deal will be working for in the coming months, is to work through the trade union movement, through our own movement, organising in the ground, organising in communities, demonstrating what a Green New Deal really means, and building a really powerful base to organise from. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really good. I'm interested that you said the climate crisis is a capitalism crisis, inequality of consumption, and that, thank you, Andrew. I do apologise. I'm very interested in what you said, that the climate crisis is a climate of capitalism, the inequality of consumption. The Green New Deal was passed at conference, and you're quite right. We must not let the current Labour leadership let that slip. We're going to have in the Port of Tyne, where I am in Newcastle, the biggest wind farm ever in the history, but it's owned by Equinox. You know, how much nicer it would be if it was municipally owned. But we'll take what we can get at the moment because jobs are so vital in this process. Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm going to bring in the next speaker, which is Mika. Welcome, Mika, to our meeting.
Hi there. Yep, thanks for having me. It's nice to be back. I think I spoke at Arise 2 years ago on a similar panel when we had more hope of an imminent Labour government to put things into practice. Less hopeful right now. I was going to start off by quickly speaking about what isn't a social solution to climate change, what isn't building back better, and that's the government's announcement in a mini budget today to spend £2 billion on retrofitting domestic homes, which they've got a lot of positive media coverage for, and even some NGOs have gone, yay, great, this is wonderful. And they've put out a claim that this will retrofit 600,000 homes over the next year in the UK. That people will be getting double glazing, new boilers, and insulating their lofts. And 600,000 sounds like quite a lot of homes, but if you look at, well, how long would that take then to retrofit all homes in the UK at that speed, and it would take 40 years, which takes us to 2060, which is 10 years after the current government net zero target, 30 years after the motion target that was passed at conference. And that's that 600,000 homes figure is also based on the government assuming that homes will only be investing about £4,000. They'll get a grant from the government for just over £3,000. They'll put most households will have to put a bit of money in themselves. So altogether, there'll only be about £4,000 going into retrofitting homes. Now, the average cost to get homes to a kind of minimal EPCC level is about £10,000. So if you spend £4,000 on homes now in 2020, 2021, then in 4 years' time, 5 years' time, you've got to go back into all those homes again, which is obviously much harder because people are like, well, you've just been in my house doing stuff. So not only does it take 40 years, but it doesn't even do the level of retrofitting, the level of insulation that we need to see to get anywhere near decarbonising. Added to the fact that the vouchers, the grants, go to homeowners only. They go to people who've got the most assets on average across the country. Social housing and also private rental effectively is largely left out of the deal. Instead of this, what could we see? And we could see transformational action at this point. Some work that I did not as Labour Energy Forum, but as Transition Economics for the TUC, we put together a plan that TUC published a couple of weeks ago, showing that you could completely transform transport within the UK within the next 2 years, making walking, biking, but also electrifying transport much easier. So half of all UK communities could receive bike lanes and pedestrianisation on a structural level across the community. Electric vehicle charging could be installed for rural businesses, places where it's harder to use public transport, for 50% of rural businesses. You could build gigafactories and renew buses and ferry fleets so that they're electric, and expand rail. At the same time, we could have significant investment into improving homes, retrofitting. So TUC's proposal included retrofitting all social housing, retrofitting 50% of social housing, which would get 100% of social housing to EPC level C within the next 2 years. At the same time as building 100,000 social homes per year, which takes us towards Shelter's target of what we need to be seeing in terms of social housing. Plus, making clean manufacturing possible. You mentioned a wind farm, Liz, off the coast of the Northeast. And one of the issues that we've seen with offshore wind in the UK, not only is it not owned by UK entities, it's largely public. It's publicly owned by Norwegian, Danish, German, Swedish entities. There is one wind turbine off the coast of the UK, which is currently publicly owned in the UK. It's offshore at high tide. At low tide, it's on the beach. But as well as these wind farms not being publicly owned, partly as a result of that, the jobs aren't here. We're not seeing the jobs that we need to be seeing and actually building the wind turbines. Wind farms off the coast of Scotland are seeing the foundations built in Indonesia and shipped 2 at a time all the way across the planet. That doesn't help the climate, and it doesn't create local jobs. It means that you end up getting a right-wing backlash going, well, this isn't for us, who's benefiting from it? Instead, we need to be upgrading ports, upgrading shipyards, making local manufacturing for renewables actually possible. And as well, not just renewables, also things like plastics. Obviously, we need to minimize plastics use as much as possible, but where it is used, we should be remanufacturing plastics here in the UK instead of exporting plastics to Thailand, where they end up sitting in piles on the beach, ending up in the ocean. That would also create good, local, decent jobs. But to make that happen, all of that's possible, but we need to see large-scale, actually large-scale state investment. So the TUC plan includes 85 billion, and that would deliver 1.2 million jobs just in clean infrastructure. IPPR talked about a larger figure, I think 1.6 million. That also included jobs in care work and NHS work, as well as the clean infrastructure. It's possible to create those jobs, and it's also necessary given the spiraling unemployment that we're seeing. But to do that, we need that large-scale investment, but it also needs to be accelerated by taking more sectors into public ownership and by using direct labor, by using in-house labor. So things like retrofitting homes will be more effective if they're done street by street, and also higher standard if they're done on that level. I'm probably being told to wrap up, although I don't see the note. So we need to be doing them in-house, and with the public sector taking a much more active role. That way we'll create well-paid unionized jobs. Rather than giving us a couple double glazed windows and some vouchers for eating out, what we need in the face of COVID and the climate twin emergencies is government fixing the foundations of the economy, not giving an extra lick of paint to the building as the roof burns away. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Mika. You know, you said so many things that resonate with us. The lack of spending on retrofitting, the taking 40 years to reach the targets that we need to reach. The grants only going to homeowners. Transforming transport, there's a great deal of education to be done there. I live near the seafront on the northeast coast, and we've just made it one-way traffic along there to allow cycles and runners on the other side of the road. And everybody's up in arms complaining. So there's a great deal of education that needs to go on. And the manufacturing is crucial. We need to start manufacturing in this country, and it's an ideal opportunity to do that. But we need large-scale investment. You're quite right. Thank you so much for that. Okay, I'm going to bring in the next speaker, and I do apologise. Apparently, I'm not on camera. I don't know why. I'm going to bring in Faiza Shaheen. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Faiza.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you to Rice for inviting me to come and speak today on this important issue of climate justice and social justice. And you know, Angus and Mika have already said so much. I guess, you know, let me just start by reminding everyone how we make sure we do both of those things at the same time. So for me, one is, and Mika's just spoken about this a lot, is the importance of jobs. So how you do climate justice in a way that brings people with you and is able to correct issues of inequality is via jobs. And that's not just any jobs. I think one of the most interesting and exciting things about a green industrial revolution or a Green New Deal is that it creates a lot of non-graduate jobs. Non-graduates in the UK are increasingly on low pay. There's increasingly fewer opportunities for them. So the jobs aspect is really interesting because it's non-graduates, and it's also in parts of the country, like depressed parts of the country that haven't had investment for a long time. So, you know, it's actually really neat how a climate plan addresses the issue of jobs. Secondly, we have to look at the international dimension and see any sharing of technology and ideas as a form of reparations. Ultimately, of course, we were the first country to industrialize, and the West is disproportionately the reason for the climate chaos that we see today, and yet it's the South that's suffering. So any type of climate justice, climate and social justice combined, has to think about the South in everything that it does, and has to think about forms of reparations. And back in 2015, when I worked for an international organization, I was at the UN when they were debating financing for development. And so I could see in the room the influence of the US negotiators, the EU negotiators, of which the British team was a part of at that time. And to be honest, it was shameful, you know, against the Brazilians and the Indians and the rest of the world, the small Pacific islands. My dad's from the Fiji Islands, so there was a small team there working in the Pacific Island group. And you know, as the 88 countries were standing up and saying, "This is your fault, and we're in trouble," the UK, EU, the US were very, very resistant to this idea of they owe the rest of the world. And when it came down to putting money on the table, it really was, really embarrassing to be British, sitting in that UN chamber. And that reparations and that idea of sharing with the rest of the world because of our hand in where we are now has got to be core to any plan. Finally, and Angus spoke about this, is the thing about kind of taxing the biggest companies and corporate interests most, not making this about individuals, which is really where the climate discussion has often gone, but looking towards the way in which capitalism is working and the way in which these 100 companies, for instance, are disproportionately, or at least the 100 companies that have to answer for 71% of the emissions, how we have a green tax and corporation taxes that really hits the richest and puts a burden on those that have caused the most damage. So yeah, for me, whenever we're thinking about climate justice, we have to be thinking about jobs, and jobs in particular for non-graduates and living outside cities and areas that haven't had a lot of investment. We have to be thinking about how we share technology, look at what is happening with movements of climate refugees, etc., and think about reparations in our plans, and also how we tax those that have caused the most damage, and those are the corporate interest. So, any plan has to involve those things. And one of the things that I was thinking about today, as I was listening to Rishi Sunak, and I, like Mika, was extremely disappointed. I probably wasn't expecting much better, but it is frustrating for those of us that have worked in this field for a while, that now we have all of these ideas, we have all of these people working on what solid policy solutions could look like. And there's really no excuse because the solutions are there. The public backs green investment. So CLASS did some work a few months ago, Labour Market Realities report, and we asked people if they supported public investment over austerity, and we found that overwhelmingly people wanted government to invest in this time rather than pay back any debt, any public spending that has accrued because of the crisis, and only 4% opposed green investment in particular. So that's 96% of the population. That's a mandate to really do something at this point. So you have Rishi Sunak standing up today, and really a very, very measly attempt, and it's really greenwashing in essence. It's I think, in essence, I think it's unforgivable. You've got Mika and others writing these incredible papers, bringing the numbers together, saying, this can create, millions of jobs, good, well-paid jobs. And we have the Chancellor standing up today and talking about 6 months work placements for young people. And that divorce from the reality of what we need versus what we're hearing on the ground today, even when the public are won over, is actually something that I really want to focus on. Like, what is going on there, and what is stopping us from moving on? Back in 2008, and I was in my first think tank job, and the financial crisis happened. So I was working a lot on various different solutions to unemployment at the time. I guess I was looking over some of that stuff today, and it really struck me how stuck we are, that even with the school strikes, even with the various different iterations of what's happened in the Labour Party, and how we have we had a big plan in the 2019 manifesto, how comes we're stuck? And I think we have to really get real about a couple of things. I think one is that we have to unite struggles. We have to build power at this time, and we have to make sure that the government is scared not to take action, that they are shamed. That seems to be the only way to get this government to do anything, with Marcus Rashford and charge for NHS workers. How are we going to build those coalitions? And it's not just the young people who unfortunately are easily ignored by a government and by a party that doesn't rely on their votes. Let's let's get real about that. So how do we build coalitions amongst groups that are in the progressive struggle? So, you know, and have leaders that can talk across different issues. So what's going on in Black Lives Matter, for instance, and there's many people at the leadership of that movement recognizing how much climate change is disproportionately affecting the Black community and the community in the South, as well as in the West. So what are we doing to kind of unify messages and make sure that we are bringing together racial injustice with social injustice and climate injustice? And you know, one of the things that still strikes me, and this was the case when I first entered the think tank world, is that the climate movement is still too often led by very white middle class people. And I know that in the conversation today, it's good to have an international voice, but I think that much more effort needs to be made. And I know that Extinction Rebellion, for instance, is trying to take those steps. But I think we have to grow the unity around what we do on climate justice and make sure we have more power and build power. And I think one of the things that we have to get better at doing, and this has been a long-term struggle for the Green movement, is bringing the public with us, because sometimes on some issues that do require lifestyle change, there can be resistance. And I know that a local issue here around the much needed ultra low emission zones because of high pollution in London, the Tories have been very effectively been able to wrap that up into an idea that this is a tax on the poor, that, you know, we don't need to be doing this ultra low emission zone. This is, you know, making it about Sadiq Khan. And, you know, that's really a worry. And I think we don't do enough to make sure that when we're putting out policies that we are getting the communications right, to make sure that people are being brought with us, because most people understand, of course, they don't want their kids growing up in a polluted atmosphere. But the Tories were out on their messaging before the Labour Party was on that, and the Green Party was on that, at least locally. And I can see the damage that it made. And finally, and I think this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that we need to understand the way in which climate justice is being twisted into this very, very ugly culture war that we have in this country now, and how it's been used to divide people, you know, supporting efforts to tackle the climate crisis as being, you know, lefty remainers that aren't proud of this country, that aren't patriotic. And I think there's all kinds of ways in which the culture war is being used. And yeah, just to wrap up, you know, I think the difference between me speaking now and 10 years ago is that we've definitely got more of a movement, and we've definitely got the ideas on the table ready to go. But what we haven't really managed to break is the resistance of the establishment, and we haven't really got to the heart of what is going on there. And we can't really move forward without really building a much bigger, powerful, unified movement against the establishment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faiza. That was so interesting. I think you're quite right. We do have to bring people with us. Jobs, particularly non-graduate jobs, are desperately needed in very depressed parts of the country, like my own and like many other parts of the country. We need to share ideas, and we need justice for the South. I think they are all absolute essentials. And we need to look at the disproportionate effect on different parts of our community. I think as far as the Labour messaging goes, I think we saw how badly we got that wrong in the general election. And we can't afford to get the messaging wrong on this vital issue. It has got to be right. Thank you so much, Pfizer. Okay, I'm going to bring in Mick Burke now from Socialist Economic Bulletin. Welcome, Mick.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much to Arise for inviting me, and thanks, Liz. I'll try to make my points briefly. I know we're all tight for time. I think it's a very timely meeting. I think there's two decisive crises that we're addressing, and we have to be addressed simultaneously, which is the climate crisis and the economic crisis that's going to be very prolonged, in my view, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. It's going to be deeper and more prolonged the longer this government fails to get on top of the public health crisis itself, which it has in common with all the other neoliberal countries, thinking of here Trump and Bolsonaro, Modi, and so on. So I think that's the backdrop. I think the one thing we can say at the outset is that there is no other project to revive the economy other than the green project, other than greening the economy and making it sustainable. No one comes up, for good reason, no one comes up with anything else that is on the horizon which can create the jobs we need, tackle the climate crisis itself, and have some return to prosperity. Like others, I watched Rishi Sunak today. I thought, frankly, it was pathetic. I thought the whole thing was pathetic. The type of measures he adopted today were the type of measures you have in response to a mild recession, rather than the deepest recession since the 1920s. And the green investment part of that was utterly, it was almost useless. Not quite. There will be maybe some home insulation, but as Mika pointed out, it's really wholly inadequate, even on the insulation part. According to one, I think, quite good piece of work from the IPPR, the estimate is that what he did today, if you take all his measures together in relation to the greening of the economy, they're about a tenth of what's immediately required, i.e. nothing like what's appropriate. And if you look at the measures taken in other countries, Germany recently a package for green investments equivalent to 36 billion pounds. Denmark, much smaller economy than the British one, equivalent to 33.5 billion. And France, equivalent to 13 billion. So the measures he has announced, Sunak, are just wholly inadequate to the situation. That's the first point I think has got to be said. Secondly, I think if we're addressing the issue of what we would do instead, and I think it's very important to do that, we have to understand what's being done in terms of investment. Because actually what the government has done and what happened from the 2008-2010 crisis wasn't actually any public investment whatsoever. What they are subsidies in general to households to consume and to businesses to invest. And the difficulty with the latter part was obviously a difficulty in relation to the climate crisis if you are solely promoting investment, although the insulation doesn't do that. There's a real difficulty in relation to the subsidies to business to invest, because that was tried and failed in 2008, 2010 onwards. And the reason it failed is because businesses don't exist to make tin cans or motor cars or provide Nando's. They exist to make profits, and if they don't think there's going to be a profit from the investment, they won't do it. That's really the case. So I often return to this point that we have to address the investment as in terms of increasing the means of production, and the means of production in this case have to be means of production which reduce the carbon footprint and reduce the unsustainable consumption of the world's natural resources. And you can't really affect the output of CO2 and the consumption of finite resources unless you address the issue of the means of production. And by that, I mean both who owns it and what you do with it. So who owns it needs to be the public sector needs to own it, the state needs to own it, and the state needs to direct investment towards driving down the carbon footprint, not encouraging, asking, cajoling, bribing the private sector, because it's the private sector, as others have pointed out, it's the private sector that have got us into this crisis in the first place. Therefore, it's really illogical to expect them to be able to get us out of it. You can't really affect the output of emissions without doing that, unless you take control of the means of reduction and invest state resources into them. You also can't, in my view, alter significantly the level of prosperity in this country or any other without doing that, if you're relying on the private sector to do so. What we've seen over the past period is a prolonged slowdown in the rate of growth of the aggregate level of prosperity, and a huge increase in inequality, which has seen the growth in prosperity accrue to smaller and smaller proportion at the top of society. Therefore, both in terms of equity and in addressing the climate crisis, it's necessary to have state investment. And here, I think it's a very important point that earlier speakers have made about winning public support, because we've seen over the past period, sometimes, not always, but sometimes competing visions in terms of the Green New Deal and the Green Industrial Revolution. And in my view, they're both needed. The Green New Deal, broadly understood, there are many variants, as there are in the Green Industrial Revolution, but the broadly understood, it's an attempt to win public support for the necessary investment in renewable energy and greening the economy by making people understand that they're going to benefit from that, going to benefit very directly and very materially. And I think that's extremely positive. And it's true, both in the sense of climate change, but also in the immediate material sense of people being better off. But it's also, following from what I've said earlier, it's also the case that the Green Industrial Revolution is necessary. I.e., you can't have something new or different or more without changing how society produces its goods and services, without changing on the basis of the move towards renewables. It's my view that socialism isn't a necessary precondition for addressing the climate crisis, at least not on a global scale. And the socialist countries do a good job, I think, in this regard. But socialist solutions are very much necessary. And by that, I mean things that address the prosperity and living standards of the mass of the population and take control of the means of production in order to achieve that and in order to reduce the carbon footprint. To give you one small example of that, of how you can achieve popular support, when the congestion charge was first introduced in London, it was really clear to people that the congestion charge proceeds were being used to subsidise bus fares. That was really clear to all Londoners. I'm a Londoner, and I was living in London at the time. And as a result, people understood that some part of society was going to be paying more, but the mass of the population, and people who live in London know this too, that it's generally poorer people and a larger proportion of Black and Asian people who use the buses, that it was going to be ordinary workers and the poor who primarily benefited from the subsidy. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to combine popular measures which benefit the overwhelming majority of the population, alongside taking increased ownership of the means of production in order to reduce the carbon footprint and reduce the consumption of finite resources. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Mick. There was so much in that in terms of an economic response. I think we would all agree that the Green New Deal is the only way forward, because no one else is putting anything else forward, as well as being urgently needed. We do need more state investment and public ownership, because you're quite right, a lot of private companies, they're not going to do it because there isn't enough profit in it. And so we do need to convince, well, not only our leadership, but the current government, that public investment is absolutely crucial at this point in time. And I worry about the ramifications if they don't see that. Thank you so much. And the other thing, of course, was socialist solutions are the only solutions that are going to get us out of this. So thank you so much for that, Mick. I'm now very, very pleased to welcome Natalie Urban to the discussion. Natalie is a Brazilian journalist. We welcome you, Natalie, and we offer you our solidarity to you and the Brazilian people at this time. Welcome.
And thank you so much, Liz Smith. Your solidarity is very much appreciated and needed. During the month of June, 2,248 fires were detected in the Amazon, the highest rate since 2007. The number also represents 18.5% more fires than in June of 2019, the year where the whole world was watching Brazil. At Brazil Wire, what we try to do is better explain the power relationships behind what's being done in the Amazonas and elsewhere. That includes what the UK government have been in Brazil in recent years. I think I'm not mistaken to say that Brazil Wire is the only media outlet that is constantly reporting what the UK government is doing there, especially their relationship with Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is not a boogeyman. He's not alone destroying the Amazon like some sort of movie villain. No, he has corporations behind him. He has other governments. He has foreigner agents behind him, helping in his destruction project. And when I'm talking about his destruction project, I'm not talking just about the environment. I'm talking about indigenous. I'm talking about Maroons. I'm talking about millions of people. They are dying, not just because of the pandemic, but because of his awful decisions that most of the times are benefiting foreign corporations. Like, for example, I don't think it's it's wrong to say that when the UK government, even though the Tories are not the most eco-friendly party, when they are like seeking out green policies for the UK, they are not thinking about in the global south. Many times they are actually cleaning up the act here and dirtying up other places. The UK government is, for example, doing a large publicity stunt in Brazil saying that they are investing in biofuel. But for those who don't know, biofuel is basically made of sugarcane, and to have the big plantations of sugarcane in Brazil, they are destroying precious native forests. And before Bolsonaro being in power, it was forbidden to plant sugarcane in the Amazon. Now it's not forbidden anymore. So probably the biodiesel that the UK government is selling out as some green solution, as a friendly solution, is actually destroying more the Amazon. And it's not just the Amazon that is being destroyed by the UK government and British company in general. For example, we have the case of Mariana, a city that has been destroyed after a dam from BHP collapsed there. And as a result, not just the city has been destroyed, but the indigenous population, the Krenak indigenous, have been also very... all the livelihood, all their village destroyed by the toxic mud. They are basically living among heavy metal and contaminated dirt. So it's very complicated. Since the Tories took power, they have been actively seeking out a war against the progressive movement, the progressive ecological parties and groups in Latin America. It's very disturbing to see that, for example, when the Amazon was burning and Bolsonaro was denying that the Brazil was living a crisis, even though the crisis is still a present crisis, that one of the few persons that he accepted help was Boris Johnson, because they are always doing things together. So when people like me ask for solidarity, I want more than just words. I need more than that. My people in Brazil need more than that. We need actions. We need MPs investigating what the UK government is doing there. We need we need MPs charging companies for destroying the environment elsewhere, not just in the UK. We need more people being held accountable for the things they are doing wrong elsewhere, not just here in the UK. So I would like to once again thanks for the opportunity, because it's hard for me and for Brazil Wire in general to spread our messages about what the UK government is doing, because people tend to blame the US for what's being done in Latin America, but the UK government has been historically horrible there as well. So if you want to save the world, you have to save the Amazon. We can't think about a socialist solution for the climate chaos without talking about Brazil, without talking about the rest of the world. So we need more than just international solidarity. We need international action to change things there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was very distressing to hear. Who would have thought Bolsonaro and Boris would be best buddies? You're quite right, of course. You know, we have a history of causing damage. Britain, we have a long history of causing damage. And it's about time we were brought to boot for it. I'm sure people here are taking notice of what you've said, and I hope that some campaigning will grow out of that, and that we can help push for international action to help Brazil at this time. And you're quite right, without the Amazon, you know, we're all done for. So thank you so much for bringing that so poignantly to our attention. We have a couple of questions now that have been posted, which I'm going to put to you and see who fancies having a go. The first is, how do we pressure the government to take action needed for our socialist solutions and Green New Deal to bring about action on the climate and what is going to be needed, given that we are not going to have a Labour government till the earliest of 2024? And secondly, what do people think about the growing links between climate change denial and the far right? Is anybody volunteering to have a go at that?
Can have a go at the first one and pass over. If that's all right.
Any volunteers?
Yeah, can you hear me, Liz?
Is that you, Angus?
Yes, yeah.
Right, okay, go ahead, Angus.
Well, on the first question, obviously, yeah, we need to defend our program, but we also, there is scope for wins in the meantime. Obviously, Extinction Rebellion and Youth Strike showed how quickly you can change the public dial of opinion and force changes. I don't think we'd be seeing popularity for the 2030 decarbonisation target, for example, without Extinction Rebellion in the streets. Secondly, pursuant to what kind of Natalie was talking about, there are wins, particularly with the UK hosting COP26 next year. It's a really good time to zero in on and build pressure on the UK's role on the global stage. And that could take two particular forms. And one is looking at, for example, the UK's support for international finance, international fossil fuel subsidies. That's been under scrutiny for a while now, and there's really scope to scrap those and build a campaign and pressure around it. And likewise, for my day job, I campaign on regulation of private finance and banks financing the fossil fuel industry and other big polluters across the world. And there are, again, pressure that we can build there and wins that we can make, all while building the socialist case.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Angus. Would anybody else like to comment on those questions?
I can say something.
Please do.
Just so the far right and already has a long history of being very engaged in climate denial. I feel like the far right in some ways receives more public attention now, increasingly, given how close or in power they are in various countries, whether it's in the US and lots of EU countries, and also the influence of the far right on the current Tory government is significantly more than it has been in the past. So I think that is it's relevant, but yeah, the far right has always been in bed, or has for a long time. Significant parts of the far right have been in bed with climate denial. But I think it's also important to think about the bits of the far right which are not stuck on climate denial, that recognize climate change, and I guess the overlaps between between ecological values and fascism in some contexts. Like you can be a green climate activist, and it's also possible, who's left-wing and socialist, it's also possible for fascists to go, climate change is real, and our solution to climate change is to put up borders. Our solution is to build walls to adapt to climate change. And that's obviously not the type of approach we want to see. And we need to be very, very careful within green movements to make sure that that kind of eco-fascist far-right strain doesn't grow, because I think that's quite a significant threat in the coming decades.
Thank you so much, Mika. Can I bring you in, Mick?
I agree in relation to, because Mika said what I would have said in relation to the far right. It has two prongs, if you like, one denial and one, shut the borders, forced population control, that type of approach. So that's definitely true. I was just going to address myself to the first question, which was how can we win? Well, however pathetic it is, I think we should take the amount of money that Rishi Sunak used to address the climate issue as a small down payment on the pressure that the government is under. As we know, the purely decorative and no intention to act bill for climate change in the far, far never, when the planet will have long been in peril, serious peril, before they intend to do anything about it. But nevertheless, I think it shows that firstly, there's a political pressure, but there's also an objective pressure, which is the economy itself. Because if I'm right, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think so, that the economic consequences of the public health crisis are going to be very real and very large for a very long period. And as I said at the outset, the only way out that anyone has envisaged of this crisis is by significant investment in renewable energy and sustainable resource use. And job creation is a key part of that. Now, absent anything else, I think if we stick to our guns and show that that's the case and keep on saying that's the case and find hundreds of different ways of making that popular, I think there's an objective pressure on the government. And it's a much bigger task, but someone earlier mentioned Marcus Rashford. I think that's a good example. This government is susceptible to pressure. You just got to apply enough of it.
Thank you, Mick. I think you're right. We've all seen the Marcus Rashford incident, and yes, what a quick turnabout. Could I bring you in, Natalie, just to comment on those questions?
Sure. Hello? Are you all listening to me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you, Natalie.
Yes. Well, I think that when we talk about the far right and being a climate denial, we have to remember that, especially in America, in Latin America, is that they are trying to continue the colonization program, that is to pile the natural resources, to send away, to make some people that usually are not there rich, like usually Europeans or North Americans rich, and to kill and genocide the traditional populations. It's happening now with the indigenous. Today, Bolsonaro said that he's refusing to offer drinkable water to indigenous. Over 300 indigenous people already die of COVID-19. We have a genocide in place in Brazil right now. And at the same time, how come those indigenous are sick? They became sick because of mining, because of logging activities in their reservations. The white man still is bringing those diseases to the indigenous in their own land. So when we talk about the far right in Brazil, for me is not a new phenomenon. It's actually just the continual project of colonizations. They will kill all the natives and just let my homeland a desert.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalie. Right, okay, I'm going to draw things to a close now. I'd like to thank everyone who's taken part. We have a huge battle ahead of us, and it's very important that people take part in the campaigns that will be up and coming, and that we have to persuade people that health, planet and peace must come before profit. We've got to get rid of the growth and profit mantra. We need people to get involved, and I think that needs to happen at a local level. We need to work together, and we cannot go back to business as usual with this government in economy and politics. A better world is possible, but this is not a fight we can afford to undertake and lose. This is a fight that we have to undertake and win. We fight to win, we fight for a better world, and the key to that is going to be a Green New Deal. I'd like just to mention the next Arise event, which is on Saturday, the 11th of July. That's the final event at 2 p.m. on Saturday. And the speakers will include John MacDonald, Diane Abbott, Claudia Webb, Richard Bergen and Ian Lavery. So there's quite a lineup for you on Saturday. Could I thank so much Mika, Mick, Natalie, Angus and Pfizer for a really, really stimulating discussion. It was lovely to meet you all. And thank you so much for joining us in Arise tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.